In the year 1598, in the final years of feudal Japan, Dai knelt in the thick, rain-soaked mud of a battlefield that had already decided his fate. His katana lay shattered beside him, the blade that once felt like an extension of his soul now reduced to useless steel. His armor was cracked and hanging loose, heavy with blood and dirt, and next to him lay the still body of his lord, Takahashi, the man Dai had sworn to protect with his life. The air smelled of iron and smoke, and distant cries of the wounded echoed like accusations. Dai had lost, not only the battle, but everything that defined him. He had failed publicly, irreversibly, and according to every law of the samurai code, unforgivably. A warrior who failed his lord had only one path left to restore honor, death. Seppuku was not considered tragedy, it was duty. It was clean, ritualistic, and respected. As night fell, Dai withdrew from the battlefield, found a quiet place, and knelt alone beneath the open sky. He removed his armor piece by piece, cleaned his hands as tradition demanded, and placed his tanto knife against his stomach. This moment was supposed to be simple. One decisive thrust and the shame would end. Yet his hand trembled. Not because he feared pain or death, but because something inside him resisted finality. As he sat there, covered in mud, blood, and humiliation, a memory surfaced, his father's voice, calm and firm, spoken years ago before his death in battle. "Any fool can die for honor," his father had said. "The true warrior lives for it." Those words struck Dai harder than any enemy blade. He realized that dying now would erase his failure, but it would also erase his chance to become more than what he was in that moment. The samurai way, he suddenly understood, was not about never falling. Every warrior falls. Every warrior breaks. The true measure of strength was something far more difficult, the refusal to remain broken. In that silent moment, Dai made a decision that went against tradition, expectation, and fear. He lowered the blade. He chose to live. He chose to rise. That choice, made in absolute darkness and disgrace, would become the foundation of everything that followed. 3 months earlier, before the mud, the blood, and the shame, Dai had been everything a samurai was expected to be. At 24 years old, he was strong, disciplined, and precise, trained since childhood in the art of the sword and the discipline of obedience. He served Lord Takahashi, a respected daimyo of Aizan province, and carried his name with pride. Dai's confidence bordered on arrogance, though he would not have seen it that way. To him, it was certainty. He was the son of a legend. His father, known as Dai the Iron, had fought in over 40 battles, never retreated, never lost a duel, and died protecting his lord with unwavering loyalty. From childhood, Dai lived in that shadow. Every instructor compared him to his father. Every elder watched him with expectation. Dai himself believed the comparisons were deserved. He trained relentlessly, mastered sword forms, studied battlefield strategy, and performed his duties with flawless precision. Yet beneath all of that excellence was a truth he had never faced: he had never been tested. He had never stood in a moment where death was unavoidable and control was an illusion. That moment arrived on a spring morning in 1598. Lord Takahashi's force of 300 samurai marched into a narrow mountain pass, unaware they were walking into a carefully planned ambush by the Usugi clan. 800 enemy warriors descended from the cliffs and forest, sealing every escape route. The clash that followed was chaos incarnate. Steel screamed against steel. Men fell in seconds. Blood soaked the ground. Dai fought well at first. His training held. He struck down 3 enemies and held his position with discipline and speed. Then fate shifted. An arrow struck Lord Takahashi's horse, sending the lord crashing to the ground. Enemy samurai surged forward instantly. Dai rushed to his lord's side, heart pounding, knowing this was the moment his entire life had prepared him for. This was where he would prove he was his father's son. He fought desperately, blocking one strike, dodging another, but the third blade tore into his shoulder. Pain exploded through his body. His grip faltered. Blood slicked his hands. A massive enemy warrior bearing the crest of the Yasuji commander charged toward Lord Takahashi. Dai leapt between them. Their blades clashed once, twice, and on the third strike, Dai's katana shattered. The sound was final, devastating. Without hesitation, the enemy's blade slid past Dai and into Lord Takahashi. Dai felt his lord's body collapse behind him. The battle was over in that instant. Dai was kicked aside like debris. Useless, the enemy spat. The survivors were captured, then released days later, not out of mercy, but as an insult. Dai walked home for 3 days with that word echoing in his mind. Useless. He was alive, and that was the cruelest punishment of all. When Dai finally reached his village, his body was healed enough to walk, but his spirit was shattered beyond recognition. Every step through familiar paths felt heavier than the last. He avoided people, yet he could feel their eyes on him, measuring him against the memory of his father and finding him lacking. When his mother saw his face, she needed no explanation. She knew. The silence between them was thick with grief. When he told her that Lord Takahashi was dead and that he had failed to protect him, she did not cry. She simply asked what he planned to do. Dai answered with the only response he believed remained honorable. He would commit seppuku. His mother's expression hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. She told him his father had died fighting, not escaping responsibility through death. She said dying was easy compared to living with failure and rising from it. Her words struck him, but they could not penetrate the weight of his shame. That night, Dai prepared for ritual death with the same discipline he had once brought to training. He washed, dressed in white, wrote his death poem, and knelt in the garden beneath the open sky. He placed the blade against his stomach, hands trembling not from fear of pain, but from the enormity of what he was about to abandon. In that silence, a memory surfaced, his father's voice from long ago, calm and unwavering, saying that any fool could die for honor, but only a true warrior could live for it. Dai remained there for a long time, the blade unmoving. Finally, he lowered it. Not because he felt brave, but because something inside him refused to accept that this moment was the end. Before dawn, he left the village without a word. He wandered for weeks with no destination, sleeping in forests, avoiding towns, surviving on what little he could find. He was no longer a samurai with a lord, nor a son worthy of his father's name. He was simply a man who had failed and refused to die for it. One evening, deep in the mountains, Dai came upon a small shrine. An old man sat there feeding birds, his presence calm and unshaken by the world. As Dai passed, the old man spoke without looking up, saying that Dai walked like a defeated warrior. Those words stopped him. No one had spoken to him so directly since the battle. When the old man asked why he had not chosen death or drink, Dai admitted he did not know. The old man invited him to sit. Dai told his story in full, expecting judgment. None came. When he finished, the old man revealed his name, Miyamoto Musashi, once called undefeated. Dai was stunned. Everyone knew that name. Yet Musashi said the title was wrong. He explained that he had been defeated many times, more times than Dai could imagine, but he had never stayed defeated. He showed Dai the words written on the dojo wall behind the shrine, fall 7 times, rise 8. Musashi said that this principle mattered more than strength, courage, or skill. Dai argued that he had failed his lord. Musashi replied that if Dai died now, that failure would become his final legacy. But if he lived, learned, and rose stronger, he could honor his lord through transformation rather than death. In that moment, something shifted within Dai. For the first time since the battlefield, his failure felt less like a verdict and more like a beginning. From the first day of training, Dai realized that Miyamoto's teachings were unlike anything he had ever experienced. There were no grand speeches about glory, no praise for effort, and no comfort offered for mistakes. On the morning after their first conversation, Miyamoto handed Dai a wooden sword and told him to fight. The duel lasted 15 seconds. Dai was disarmed, thrown to the ground, and defeated without ceremony. Before he could gather his thoughts, Miyamoto told him to stand and try again. The second match ended even faster. The third faster still. After 20 consecutive defeats, Dai's frustration boiled over. He slammed the wooden sword onto the ground and declared that he could never defeat such a master. Miyamoto calmly corrected him, saying that defeat was not the problem, refusing to rise was. He explained that the purpose of the training was not victory, but persistence. Every time Dai stood up after falling, he was strengthening the one quality that mattered above all others, the refusal to quit. Day after day, Dai lost. He lost to Miyamoto, to senior students, to younger students, even to boys half his size. Each loss burned his pride. Each fall reminded him of the battlefield and his shattered blade. Yet something subtle began to change. After dozens of defeats, Dai stopped throwing his sword down in anger. After hundreds, he stopped seeing each loss as proof of weakness. He began to observe instead, his footwork, his timing, his grip, his awareness. Miyamoto told him that defeat was information, not identity. The more honestly Dai studied his failures, the more valuable they became. Weeks turned into months, and the number of losses climbed into the hundreds. Dai cried in private, doubted himself, and nearly quit many times. But each morning, he rose and returned to the training ground. One day, after more defeats than he could count, Dai won a single match against a younger student. It was not impressive or elegant, but it was real. Miyamoto congratulated him, then immediately reframed the moment. Dai had not defeated another warrior, he had defeated the part of himself that wanted to give up. That victory mattered more than any duel. Miyamoto explained that most men quit after 3 or 4 defeats, convincing themselves they lacked talent or destiny. Dai, however, had proven he could endure hundreds of failures without surrendering. That endurance made him dangerous. Not because he was invincible, but because no amount of loss could stop him. Through this relentless training, Dai began to understand that Miyamoto was not teaching him how to fight better. He was teaching him how to be unbreakable. Skill could be stolen, strength could fade, but the habit of rising could not be taken once it was forged. The sword was merely a tool, the true weapon was the mind that refused to remain on the ground. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the training ground fell silent, Miyamoto gathered his students and spoke directly to Dai, though the lesson was meant for everyone present. He explained that repeated failure reshapes the human mind in one of 2 ways. For most people, it creates helplessness. When failure is experienced again and again without understanding, the mind concludes that effort is pointless, and it shuts down. This is why so many warriors, and so many people beyond the battlefield, quit after their first serious defeat. But there is another path. When failure is met with the belief that improvement is possible, the mind adapts. It grows stronger under pressure, becoming more resilient with every fall. Miyamoto described how the brain's fear center reacts to defeat by urging retreat and surrender, while the higher reasoning mind has the ability to override that fear. Every time Dai chose to rise instead of quit, he strengthened that control. He was not just training his body, he was rewiring his mind to see defeat as temporary rather than permanent. Miyamoto explained that this mental transformation was the foundation of all true warriors. He then spoke of Buddhist teachings, describing how attachment to victory makes defeat unbearable. When a person believes their worth depends on winning, every loss feels like annihilation. But when identity is placed in the process rather than the outcome, defeat loses its power. Dai began to understand that his suffering after the battlefield had not come from failure itself, but from his attachment to the image of who he believed he was supposed to be. Miyamoto then introduced the concept of rebirth, drawing on the symbol of the phoenix that burns and rises from its ashes. Dai, he said, had already died on that battlefield, not physically, but spiritually. The arrogant, untested version of himself had been destroyed. What remained was the raw material for something stronger. To rise from that destruction was not denial of pain, but mastery over it. Miyamoto reminded the students that many of history's greatest warriors had faced catastrophic defeat before achieving greatness. Those who avoided failure remained fragile. Those who faced it and quit stayed broken. Only those who faced it, endured it, and rose became legends. As Dai listened, he felt the weight of his past failures lift slightly. They were no longer stains on his honor, but necessary steps in his transformation. That night, he sat alone and reflected on the countless times he had fallen during training. Each fall had trained him to rise faster, calmer, and more determined. He realized that strength was not something granted by talent or destiny. It was built, one refusal to quit at a time. Several months into his training, the lesson Miyamoto had been preparing Dai for finally arrived in the form of a test that felt terrifyingly real. A wandering ronin named Teisha appeared at the shrine, tall, scarred, and openly contemptuous. He announced that he had come to test the school's reputation, declaring that if one of Miyamoto's students could defeat him, he would acknowledge the dojo's worth. If not, he would leave and spread word that the teachings there were hollow. Miyamoto showed no reaction to the insult. Instead, he turned to Dai and calmly told him to face the challenger. Dai's chest tightened. He had improved, but Teisha carried himself like a man shaped by countless real battles. When they bowed and began, Teisha attacked with brutal efficiency. His strikes were heavy and fast, driving Dai backward. Within moments, Dai was struck in the ribs and sent crashing to the ground. Teisha stood over him and told him to stay down, mocking his effort. In the past, those words would have shattered Dai's resolve. Now, they triggered something different. He remembered the principle etched into his mind through endless defeat. He rose. They fought again. Dai fell again. He rose again. Each time he stood, his movements became calmer. He was no longer fighting to prove himself or erase his past. He was fighting because rising was what he did. After the seventh fall, Teishi's expression changed. The arrogance faded, replaced by unease. Dai was battered, exhausted, and clearly overmatched in strength, yet he continued to stand without hesitation. On the eighth exchange, something shifted. Dai stopped forcing his attacks and began to flow with Teishi's movements, redirecting rather than resisting. When Teisha struck, Dai found an opening and placed his wooden sword gently against the ronin's throat. The victory was clean, undeniable, and silent. The other students erupted, but Miyamoto remained still. He explained that Teishi's skill was real, but it was brittle because it relied on avoiding defeat. Dai's strength, forged through repeated failure, could not be broken by a single loss or fear. Teisha bowed deeply, acknowledging that he had been taught rather than tested. That night, Miyamoto told Dai that he had not simply won a duel. He had discovered something far greater, that he could not be truly defeated as long as he refused to remain down. This realization marked a turning point. Dai no longer feared future battles, not because he believed he would always win, but because losing no longer threatened his identity. He had become unbreakable, not through power, but through persistence. After that victory, Miyamoto made it clear that Dai's journey was far from complete. Winning a single duel, even one born from repeated failure, was only proof that the foundation had been laid. True unbreakability, he explained, is tested not in moments of triumph, but in prolonged hardship where progress feels invisible and motivation fades. To forge this, Miyamoto announced a new phase of training designed to strip Dai of comfort entirely. He called it the Path of the Seven Mountains, each one representing a different form of resistance a warrior must overcome. The first mountain tested the body. Dai was ordered to carry a heavy stone to the summit of a steep mountain path. The climb lasted hours. His legs trembled, his lungs burned, and several times he set the stone down, convinced he could go no further. Each time, the familiar urge to quit rose within him, whispering that rest would be reasonable, even wise. Each time, he remembered the rule that had reshaped him. Falling was allowed. Staying down was not. He lifted the stone again and continued until he reached the summit, collapsing in exhaustion but alive with a quiet sense of victory. The second mountain tested the mind. Miyamoto confined Dai to a dark meditation chamber for days, with little food and no distraction. Deprived of movement and stimulation, Dai was forced to face his thoughts without escape. Memories of his lord's death, the battlefield, and his own failure surged relentlessly. The temptation to pound on the door and beg for release was overwhelming. Yet he remained seated, breathing through the storm. By the final day, the noise in his mind softened, and beneath it he discovered a calm that could endure even intense discomfort. The third mountain tested social courage. Dai was sent back to his home village, where his shame was known and whispered about. Faces turned away when they recognized him. Some spoke openly of his failure. Each glance felt like a blade. He stayed anyway, walking through the village with his head raised, neither defending himself nor hiding. He learned that rising sometimes means standing still and absorbing pain without reaction. The fourth mountain tested skill through humility. Dai challenged multiple sword masters, losing most of the encounters. Each defeat threatened to reopen old doubts, but instead of withdrawing, he studied each loss carefully and continued. The fifth mountain confronted fear directly. Miyamoto led him to a high cliff and ordered him to jump into the river below. Every instinct screamed against it, yet Dai stepped forward and leapt. He survived, shaken but alive, and repeated the jump until fear no longer controlled his action. Through these trials, Dai understood that rising was not a single act, but a way of living that demanded consistency in the face of exhaustion, shame, fear, and monotony. By the time Dai completed those trials, something fundamental had changed inside him. The instinct to quit, once loud and persuasive, had grown quiet. It still appeared, but now it sounded weak, like an old voice repeating lies he no longer believed. Miyamoto explained that this was the real transformation, not stronger arms or sharper technique, but a new relationship with failure itself. Failure was no longer an enemy to avoid, it was a signal, a teacher, sometimes even a necessary companion. To deepen this understanding, Miyamoto introduced what he called the patience trial, a phase of training that appeared almost meaningless on the surface. For 30 days, Dai was given a single task, polishing an old sword that did not belong to him. Hour after hour, day after day, he repeated the same motion. There was no visible progress for long stretches, no praise, no sense of advancement. His mind rebelled violently. Thoughts arose telling him this was a waste of time, that a real warrior should be sparring, traveling, proving himself. Several times he felt the familiar itch to abandon the task and seek something more dramatic. But each time he noticed that urge, he recognized it as another form of quitting disguised as ambition. So he stayed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his patience deepened. He learned to remain present even when effort brought no immediate reward. Miyamoto later explained that many warriors fail not because they cannot endure pain, but because they cannot endure boredom and delayed results. This lesson prepared Dai for the final and most difficult challenge, the one Miyamoto called the Mountain of Purpose. Dai was given a choice. He could leave now, stronger than before, capable of living a quiet and respectable life, or he could face the man who had killed his lord. Not to fight him, not to seek revenge, but to thank him. At first, the idea felt unbearable. Gratitude toward the source of his deepest pain seemed impossible, even insulting. Yet Dai understood that this challenge was not about the other man, but about whether hatred still controlled him. He traveled for days until he found the warrior, now living a humble life far from the battlefield. When Dai bowed and expressed his gratitude, the words felt heavy but honest. In that moment, something released inside him, a final knot of resentment dissolving. He realized that as long as he clung to anger, part of him remained frozen on that battlefield. By letting go, he truly rose beyond it. When Dai returned to Miyamoto, the master needed no explanation. He saw the change immediately. Dai no longer carried himself like a man proving something. He moved with quiet certainty, grounded and calm. Miyamoto told him that his training was complete, not because he would never fall again, but because he had learned to rise without hesitation. Dai understood then that mental unbreakability was not the absence of pain, fear, or defeat. It was the refusal to let those experiences define the end of his story. From that point forward, every setback would simply be another fall, followed inevitably by another rise. Years later, Dai stood in a place he never imagined during his darkest night in the mud. He had become a master in his own right, not famous for never losing, but known across provinces as the samurai who could not be broken. Students traveled long distances to train under him, drawn not by stories of flawless victories, but by rumors of a man who had failed more than anyone else and still stood tall. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, a young warrior named Kenji arrived at Dai's dojo. His posture was stiff, his eyes heavy with shame. He bowed deeply and confessed that he had failed his first real battle, had frozen in fear, and believed his honor was beyond repair. Like Dai once had, Kenji spoke of death as if it were duty, of ending his life to erase his mistake. Dai listened quietly, seeing his own past reflected in the young man's trembling hands. Instead of anger or judgment, he felt understanding. Dai asked Kenji to stand and look around the dojo. He pointed to the worn wooden floors, the scarred training posts, the students practicing despite bruises and exhaustion. He told Kenji that every mark in that place was proof of failure survived, not failure avoided. Dai explained that death might end pain quickly, but it also ends possibility. Living with failure, carrying it forward, transforming it into strength, that was the harder and more honorable path. He told Kenji about falling hundreds of times under Miyamoto's watch, about wanting to quit more days than he could count, and about the single decision that changed everything, rising one more time. Dai explained that honor was not a fragile thing shattered by one mistake. It was forged slowly, through choices made after defeat. Kenji's shoulders began to loosen as the words sank in. For the first time since his failure, he felt the weight on his chest lift slightly. Dai placed a wooden sword in Kenji's hands and told him they would begin immediately, not tomorrow, not after more thinking. Kenji struck the post clumsily, embarrassed by his weakness. Dai corrected him gently, then told him to strike again. Each attempt was imperfect, but each was a step forward. As the other students watched, Kenji fell, rose, and tried again, his fear slowly giving way to determination. Dai realized in that moment that the lesson he had received was now passing through him into another life. The cycle continued, just as Miyamoto had hinted long ago, stretching beyond time and individual names. Dai looked at the kanji on the dojo wall and understood that the true legacy of a warrior was not victory, but resilience. Battles would be lost, bodies would fail, and the world would strike without mercy, but as long as someone chose to rise, the story was never over. In teaching Kenji to stand again, Dai felt the quiet certainty that the technique of becoming unbreakable would live on, carried forward one rise at a time. As the seasons turned and years continued to pass, Dai's teaching spread far beyond the walls of his dojo. Travelers carried stories of a samurai who spoke more about endurance than dominance, more about discipline than glory. Some were confused by this, expecting tales of legendary duels and flawless victories. But those who listened closely understood that Dai was offering something far rarer, a way to live without being crushed by failure. When people asked him for the secret, he never spoke in complicated philosophies or mystical language. He told them that strength was built in ordinary moments, when no one was watching and quitting would be easy. He explained that discipline was not a surge of motivation, but a quiet agreement made with oneself to keep going even when enthusiasm disappeared. Dai often spoke about the danger of waiting to feel ready. He reminded his students that readiness is not a feeling that arrives before action, it is something forged through action itself. Many nodded politely at these words, but only a few truly understood them, because understanding required practice, not agreement. To those few, Dai revealed the final truth he had learned under Miyamoto. Life itself, he said, follows the same pattern as training. There will be moments of progress, moments of stagnation, and moments of collapse that feel final. The mistake most people make is believing that collapse means the journey has ended. In reality, it is simply an invitation to rise again, wiser and stronger than before. Dai warned his students that the world would constantly offer excuses to stop, to settle, to accept less than their potential. Comfort, fear, and comparison would whisper that persistence was unnecessary or foolish. But he urged them to remember that every time they chose effort over ease, they strengthened the part of themselves that could not be controlled by circumstance. Near the end of his life, Dai returned once more to the battlefield where his lord had fallen. The land was quiet now, covered in grass and wildflowers. He knelt and closed his eyes, not in mourning, but in gratitude. That moment of failure, once the source of unbearable shame, had become the foundation of everything he had built. Without it, he would never have learned to rise. As he stood and turned away, Dai felt no regret. He had lived as a warrior not because he never fell, but because he always stood back up. His story, like the lesson itself, did not end there. It lived on in every person who faced defeat and chose action over despair, discipline over comfort, and resilience over surrender. And so, the path of the unbreakable warrior continued, not as legend or myth, but as a quiet, daily practice available to anyone willing to rise one more time.